Welcome. It is so glad to see all of you here for this program. I'm so excited to see so many faces here and so many visitors here with us today. Thank you for joining us on this just really special occasion where we're getting to partner with Temple Mishkan, Israel, as well as the Alabama Holocaust Education Center to put on this program of remembrance. I'm excited about this. Just a few things. My name is Amy George. For those of you that don't know, I'm the rector here at St. Paul's. Also, there is a wonderful exhibit from Darkness into Light across in the lower hall. I hope you will take the time to read those wonderful panels. I've asked Ronnie if we could keep it here longer, and we're going to get to keep it here for the week. So if you didn't get a chance to read it, you may come in during the week when the church is open and just take your time so you can absorb some of the material because it's really powerful. So I hope you'll do that. And as always, because, at heart I am a preacher, we have to start out with prayer. So let us pray. God of the past, present, and future, we remember today 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, the millions of other victims of Nazi persecution, and all those who have been targeted and killed in subsequent genocides. We remember those having survived genocides share their stories with us. We give thanks to you for the lessons of human stories, both in their suffering and in their joy. We remember those who stood up against injustice and saved lives. We give thanks to you for their example. Together, we acknowledge the sacrifice of those that stood together with those who suffered during the Holocaust and other genocides. And we affirm that every life is loved by you and is sacred. Yet during the Holocaust, too many failed to stand together with their neighbors. Oppression stains your world and contradicts your love. So we pray that you will inspire us now as we stand together on this day in the love that we know of God. Let us commit to remembering and glorify God in our words and actions. We make these prayers in the name of the one true God who journeys with us into the eternal hope of your truth and light. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to get to introduce Ronnie Leet that I've worked with on this. He is the president of Temple Mishkan, Israel. Ronnie?
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. And of course, short people need help, so I'm helping myself. Thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful tribute to the story that all of you found time to come out today and be with us. As Amy mentioned, I'm Ronnie Leet. I'm a member of Congregation Mishkan, Israel, which the congregation has been here for 152 years, as well as our beautiful historic temple down the street on Broad Street that's been here for 122 years. It says in your program that I am president of Temple Mishkan, Israel. I'm not sure that that's the proper term when you consider the thought of a president that's a leader of a large group of people. When you're president of a local congregation of 3, I don't know that term applies, but we're proud to still be here, and that is part of the message of today that St. Paul's and Temple Mishkan Israel can hopefully do something for this community and be a part of this community, especially as our congregation used to be dating back to 1870. I want to, of course, thank Reverend Amy George and the St. Paul's Vestry for partnering with us for this program. It signifies a wonderful relationship between our two congregations. We believe that you will be enlightened and moved by this program and know why it's important to understand the scope of the Holocaust. I want to thank a member of our temple family from Birmingham, Barbara Erdrich Fine, who nudged me, and that's putting it mildly, but very politely, supporting me for this program and introducing me to the Alabama Holocaust Education Center in Birmingham and to our talented speaker. Another Barbara I need to thank is my wife, who always supports and helps me in whatever endeavors that I partake in, so I'm thankful for her. Also in attendance from Birmingham is Betty Steinmetz, whose husband Max Steinmetz was a Holocaust survivor. I was honored to hear Max tell his story several years ago in Tuscaloosa, which what moved me to try to make a program like this happen in Selma. So Betty, thank you for being here. The significance of the yellow daffodil pins is described in your program and on a card attached to the pin. I hope you will read it and want to support its message. Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day, occurs each year to remember the victims and honor the survivors of the Holocaust. Today we honor Yom HaShoah with our program of remembrance. We also mark the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which occurred on April 19, 1943, by participating in the Daffodil Campaign through the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. During the Holocaust, the Nazis isolated Jews by forcing them into enclosed districts known as ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto in Poland was established in 1940. It was the largest ghetto and held captive approximately 400,000 Jews. The living conditions were horrific, and the thousands of Jews died because of disease, overcrowding, and starvation. On April the 19th, 1943, Jewish fighters launched their final act of armed resistance lasting 27 days. This brave act of resistance came to be known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Using only homemade weaponry, ghetto fighters were able to hold off 2,000 Nazi soldiers and police for 27 days before the ghetto was leveled to the ground. On May 16th, the Nazi official in charge reported that the former Jewish quarter in Warsaw is no more. The candle lighting is a tradition that serves to replenish the light after a time of darkness. Today, we light this unique six-armed Holocaust menorah in memory of the 6 million Jews whom the Nazis destroyed. I would like to invite up Hannah Berger, the daughter of Holocaust survivors Frida and Herman Berger, to share a memorial prayer. Hannah.
If you will, please rise for the lighting of the memorial candles and for the prayer that will follow. If Rabbi Kramer of the Good Israeli Society Synagogue in Montgomery will join me, a word first about the prayer. The prayer that we will do is called El Malai Rachamim. It's a prayer for the departed, and it asks for comfort and everlasting care deceased. The rabbi will chant it in Hebrew, and then I will read an English version that is an adaptation for this occasion.
Kazor Mazir Hakim Maziri
God, full of compassion, whose presence is over us, may the souls of the dead, 6 million of whom were Jewish, who perished in the shore and who have gone to their everlasting home, find the safety and rest denied them on earth, beneath the shelter of your presence. Source of mercy, cover them in the shelter of your wings forever, and bind their souls into the gathering of life. It is God who is their heritage. May they be at peace in their place of rest. Amen. Let's be seated.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Rabbi Kramer. That was beautiful. Ann May Molligarden served as the education director of the Alabama Holocaust Education Center for 20 years since its inception in 2002. She recently stepped down from that position to work as an applied researcher with the AHEC in order to further develop the testimonies of over 175 Holocaust survivors who made their home in Alabama. In this new capacity, she's currently focusing her attention on Holocaust survivors who made their home in Selma. Anne has dedicated her life to educating others about the history and lessons of the Holocaust, and in particular, her father's story as a Holocaust survivor. She has studied extensively with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, Facing History in Ourselves, and other national and international organizations. She has traveled internationally to further her studies. Please welcome Ann Molligarden.
Welcome, everyone. I want to start by thanking St. Paul's Episcopal Church and Reverend Amy and for opening your spiritual home to us today. And also I want to thank Ronnie Leet and Barbara Fine, as well as Temple Mishkan Israel, for your vision in creating this program of remembrance. While the Holocaust is one of the most thoroughly documented events in world history, the same cannot be said of the stories of its survivors. Many survivors of the Holocaust have never spoken about their experience. Many passed away before ever doing so. I was invited to join you today to speak about the efforts of the Alabama Holocaust Education Center, the AHEC, to document the stories of Alabama's survivors of the Holocaust. Specifically, I'm here to speak to you about Selma's Holocaust survivors, your friends and neighbors, several of whom first came to Selma as refugees, fleeing Nazi persecution. They built new families in Selma. They made new friendships in Selma. They became Alabamians and Americans in Selma. But I would wager that most of you do not know these individuals as survivors. That's a term that many of those that faced the prospect of murder by the Nazis and their collaborators have found difficult to embrace, much less to say this aloud amongst their friends and their neighbors. It's my job and that of the AHEC to help give them that voice. And for those that have already passed, to document their stories, to record and tell these stories of survival, not just for the sake of history and not just because of the power of storytelling. It's also for our benefit, and today for your benefit. Because it is my hope that when you leave this afternoon, you will appreciate that these are also Selma's stories. that they belong to each and every one of you. Let me introduce you to the Berger family. Hermann Berger and his wife, Frieda Kahn Berger, immigrated to Selma from Niedersachsen, Germany in September 1938. After a long, arduous journey to the U.S., Hermann and Frieda first lived with relatives in New York City. Frieda was the first to find work as a housekeeper. Hermann was a skilled tailor, but unable to find any long-term work. After 6 months of searching for permanent work, Hermann registered with the National Refugee Service, an organization that was helping refugees settle throughout the United States. The Bergers were searching to relocate wherever work was available. Selma at that time was a town of about 20,000 residents, 300 of whom were Jewish. The town's Jewish leadership had contacted the National Refugee Service and indicated that Selma could help a few refugees settle here. There was an elderly Jewish tailor in Selma around this time, and after he passed, the congregation of Temple Mishkan, Israel, which as you know is now celebrating its 13th decade in Selma, invited Hermann and Frieda Berger to join the community and sponsored them upon their arrival. What did sponsorship mean? Well, it meant assisting 2 immigrants from Germany build a life in a small, utterly foreign Alabama town. While New York certainly wasn't Niedersachsen, Selma certainly wasn't New York. The members of Temple Mishkan Israel loaned Hermann the funds to establish a tailor shop in Selma, a loan that he was able to repay in full in just over 2 years. Amidst that commercial success, and as the family found their footing in the U.S., the Bergers were wrestling with personal tragedy. Hermann's parents, Frieda's parents, 2 of Hermann's siblings, and 3 of Frieda's siblings were all murdered at the extermination camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. But the Bergers were intent on building a new life, and they did so on the foundation of the generosity of this community. Hermann and Frieda became active members at Temple Mishkan Israel, and in 1942, they had a daughter in Selma. They named her Hannah Leon. Hannah after her paternal grandmother, Johanna Friesen Berger, and Leon after Fanny Leon Barton, Frieda's closest friend in Selma, who used to take Frieda out for chocolate ice cream. Fanny's husband was an owner of Barton's department store on Washington Street in Selma, and one of the businessmen who recruited Hermann to come to Selma. Hannah Berger you met earlier today. Next, I want to introduce you to the Pollock family. Rose Bernstein Pollock, her son Charles, and her daughter Ernestine, who some of you may have known as Ernie, lived in Selma. The Pollocks came here from Horn, Austria in 1939. They were sponsored by Rose's maternal uncle, Harry Mehring Sr., who had emigrated from Russia to Selma in the late 1800s and founded Southern Clothing and Notions Company at the foot of the Pettus Bridge. Rose's brother, Reuben Bernstein, also assisted Rose and her children. Reuben had joined his uncle Harry in Selma 2 years earlier in 1937. The Mehring family provided a first home for the Pollocks when they arrived in Selma, and later a job for Charles. Rose's husband and the father of Charles and Ernie had died in Europe in 1936, and Rose had been the sole breadwinner for the family ever since. She continued to do so in Selma, starting work at the old City National Bank soon after the family's arrival. The Pollock family gradually acclimated to life in small-town Alabama. Sometimes that happened organically, and sometimes they made sure it happened through more or less deliberate means. On the deliberate side of things, Charles recalls that when the family arrived, he was quote, scared as hell because he couldn't understand a thing people were saying. To remedy that, Rose wouldn't let the kids speak anything but English in their home. Charles said she wouldn't even give them food as a child unless they asked in English. Rose also decided to change the family's name to make it easier for their new neighbors to pronounce. The family, known as the Polaceks in Austria, became the Selma Polacks. On the more organic side of things, Charles and Ernie quickly got used to their new home and became all-American kids. Charles recalls an idyllic childhood here in Selma. And like the Bergers, the Polacks found a second family at Mishkan, Israel, and in Selma at large. And much like the Bergers, Rose never spoke about the life in Europe that she had left behind. Rose lost her parents and 3 of her 5 siblings in the Holocaust. Charles's idyllic childhood in Selma that I mentioned, that was followed by 2 years at the University of Alabama, and then in 1950, a call into active duty in the Korean War, where Charles served as a tank commander. He was awarded the Korean Service Medal with a Bronze Star, the United Nations Service Medal, the Korean War Service Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, and the Army Good Conduct Medal. Charles is a refugee. He is a survivor. He is a defender of his adopted country. As an article about Charles's military experience in the Selma Times Journal put it, Charles represents the best of America in patriotism and service to others. What a blessing for America when it welcomed Charles V. Pollock to its shores. And what a blessing for all of you, because it was Selma that welcomed him and his family. Charles was not able to be with us today. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, Germany's Jews numbered about 525,000, less than 1% of the German population. Germany's Jewish community was diverse with respect to its economic situation, their level of education, their political affiliation, and the degree to which they were religiously observant. In other words, just like I suspect not everyone here in this sanctuary today attends church every Sunday, not every Jew went to synagogue every Saturday. The Jews of Germany were highly assimilated into German society. About this time, Hermann Berger and Frida Kahn were growing up in neighboring villages in Germany, in an area known as the Rhineland, where Jews had lived since the 15th century. Frida's family from Niedersachsen, and Hermann's family was from the slightly smaller village of Bergsbro. It's only a 7-minute drive from Niedersachsen to Bergsbro today. Frida's father, Joseph, was a butcher by trade and had served for Germany during World War I. Frida described their social status as, quote, one step above peasants, but they had dear friends and deep roots. Hermann's family, Frida said, was, quote, one step above hers. He came from a family of tailors. The synagogue in Niedersachsen served both of these communities. Jewish children went to public school along with other children in the 2 towns. The Jewish students attended cheder or religious school, just like Sunday school here. Now, at the same time, Rose Polacek was growing up in Lithuania. She was one of 6 siblings born to an observant Jewish family that spoke Yiddish in the home. Her father was a textile manufacturer. Her mother ran the household with an iron hand. As her brother once said, quote, God help one of those 6 children if you did not show up when Mama was lighting the Sabbath candles. Rose was first educated at a private religious school before moving to Vienna to study piano at the Vienna Conservatory of Music. It was during her time in Vienna that Rose met her future husband, Theodor Polacek. Theodor had been a colonel in the Austrian army during World War I, and after they married, the two returned to his hometown of Horn, Austria, where Theodore owned a brewery. Roughly 9 million Jews, just like the Bergers and the Pollocks, lived in countries that would be occupied by Germany during World War II. These Jews were not outcasts. They were not others. They were Germans. They were Lithuanians. They were butchers. They were tailors and veterans who had fought for their countries. By the end of the Second World War, 2 out of every 3 of them would be dead. The question posed to every one of us, unanswerable but so essential for that very reason, is why? After Germany's defeat in World War I, Germany was forced to accept moral and financial responsibility for the unprecedented destruction that had devastated Europe. The German parliamentary democracy that formed after World War I was never able to find stable footing. By the time the Great Depression reached Germany in 1929, there was runaway inflation and rampant unemployment. Some Germans responded by seeking radical political solutions. They turned to a newly formed party, the Nazis, and their charismatic leader, a former Bavarian army lance corporal named Adolf Hitler. Hitler and the Nazis offered the discontent German people an inflammatory combination of patriotism and racism. The Nazis promised that they would end economic instability. They promised they would restore Germany's status as a world power. They promised they would renew the dignity of the German people. But it is important to note that despite these promises, open elections were only able to deliver Hitler to the threshold of power. The German people never voted Hitler into power. He was a political backdoor deal. It was that deal that paved the way for him to become Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. Nonetheless, within 2 years, Hitler had seized that opportunity and consolidated his authority into a radical dictatorship. So what were these ideological foundations for the Nazis? In a nutshell, Nazism was an ideology based on race and space. The Nazis believed that all of human history is a struggle among races to ultimately control spaces, meaning territory. From those spaces, the prevailing race would then be able to generate food, wealth, and prosperity. So what are those races? Well, drawing on popular pseudo-scientific theories of the time, the Nazis divided the world into competing inferior and superior races, each struggling for survival and dominance. The Nazis maintained that the Aryans, or Germanic peoples, were a biologically superior master race destined to rule the world. The Slavic peoples, the Roma, or what we would often call gypsies, and the blacks, among others, were considered biologically inferior. These inferior races were destined to be subject to Aryan rule. Jews, too, were seen as a homogeneous race that sat at the very bottom of the Nazi racial hierarchy. Today, we more accurately know Jews not as a race, but as a member of a religious faith. The Nazis also saw the Jews as having no country of their own, that is, no space of their own, and this meant that the Jews were akin to occupiers in the space of others. Worse yet, the Nazis believed they acted as parasites on the other races, draining the strength of their hosts. It follows then from this perverse logic that the Jew had to be contained and ultimately removed from the German sphere. Germany's success in its struggle for survival required the extermination of the Jews. And Adolf Hitler presented himself as the one person singled out by Providence who could deliver this for Germany. Professor Peter Hayes, a historian formerly from Northwestern University, describes how Nazi Germany underwent a three-phase process of learning or discovery between 1933 and 1941, as it figured out how to accomplish these goals of race and space. I'm going to adapt that framework in telling the story of those years. In the first phase, which lasted for just over 5 years, from the time Hitler came to power in 1933 until Germany's annexation of Austria in March 1938, the Nazis learned what they could do. The Nazis learned that they could persecute German Jews without encountering serious resistance from other German citizens or from other countries. During this 5-year period, the Nazis issued almost 400 anti-Jewish decrees that gradually stripped Jewish Germans, such as Hermann and Frieda Berger, of their rights, their livelihoods, and their property. The Nazi decrees essentially made it law that the Jews would be paupers, and they separated them from professional and public life. For many Jews, Germany became a country they could no longer call home. But immigration was not simply a matter of packing their bags. In addition to the reams of documentation that were required, the Nazis imposed debilitating immigration taxes. Though one would think the Nazis would be pleased to see them go, the Nazis were not going to allow the Jews to leave without paying an unconscionable price. For those who wanted to immigrate to the U.S., they also had to prove that they would not become an economic burden here, meaning the Nazis were going to be taking all of their money as they left, and yet they would need to prove their wealth in order to come to the United States. You can appreciate the predicament. In practice, the combination of the two typically meant that German Jews seeking to emigrate to the U.S. had to find a U.S. sponsor, preferably a relative, who would promise to take responsibility for them after they arrived. That was the situation confronting the minority of Jews that could even fathom leaving. Most could not. They had raised their families in Germany, built their businesses in Germany, fought for Germany. Germany was their home. They were Jews, yes, but they were also Germans. For those of the Jewish faith who stayed, most felt surely that their fellow Germans would come to their senses. They could not imagine that the persecution would get any worse. Now, every family had a different calculus. So what of the Bergers, and what of the Polacheks? Hermann Berger and Frieda Kahn were in their late 20s and early 30s when Hitler came to power. Although their families had known each other since childhood, they first became close after the Nazis banned Jews from participating in German civic and social organizations. Suddenly, outcasts among their former friends, Hermann and Frieda took solace in each other and helped to form a new Jewish youth organization. Hermann became president. Frieda was the organization's secretary. Hermann was aware of the Nazis' ever-growing tightening noose, and even before the two married, he had decided to leave Germany. A cousin in New York had agreed to be his sponsor. The plan was for Hermann to send for his new wife as soon as he could, but 1 week before his departure, an affidavit arrived for Frieda as well. The couple were able to leave Germany together in February 1938. Both of their parents remained behind, as did Frieda's 8 siblings and Hermann's 3 siblings. Rose Polachek, on the other hand, was married and living in Austria around this time. The rest of her family was still in Lithuania, including her brother Reuben, an attorney. Even in Lithuania, which is geographically separated from Germany by all of modern-day Poland, Reuben knew that a storm was brewing. Since Hitler's rise to power, things had gotten worse for Jews throughout Europe. Reuben had friends attending various colleges in Germany at the time, and the reports coming back to Lithuania suggested that Germany was feverishly preparing for war. So in 1936, when his Uncle Harry Mering Sr. invited Reuben to come to Selma, he jumped at the chance. It would take Rose Polachek a little longer to take that leap. Now let's move to phase 2, as Professor Hayes describes it, which lasted for a little more than 3 years, from the German takeover of Austria in March 1938 until its attempted invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. During this period, Nazi Germany learned what it could not achieve, namely the complete removal or expulsion of Jews from its territory. Unable to remove the Jews, the Nazis decided that other tactics would be necessary to make Germany Judenrein, or free of Jews. Germany's sudden annexation of Austria in March of 1938 brought 200,000 additional Jews under the Nazi rule. Unlike the German Jews, who had been slowly squeezed by Nazi regulations over a 5-year period, the persecution of the Jews of Austria was much more accelerated. The Austrian Jews took notice, and in 1938, for the first time, requests for U.S. visas from Austria surpassed those from Germany. Rose Polachek was now directly impacted. She and her children were living in Horn, Austria, when the Germans invaded. Charles was 7 years old at the time. Ernie was 6. Rose's husband, Theodore, who had died 2 years earlier, was not there to help. She was struggling to run the family brewery and raising her children as a single mother. In one of Charles's earliest memories, he recalls listening to the radio with his mother and Ernie as the announcer described the Nazi invasion. He remembers his mother's terror, and by the next morning, there were swastika flags hanging throughout the city. Fortunately for Rose and her children, her Uncle Harry Mering Sr. and her brother Reuben were monitoring the rapidly changing dynamics in Europe closely from Selma. They initiated the process of bringing Rose and her children to the U.S. Now, Rose had married an Austrian, but because he was deceased, she needed to reestablish her Lithuanian citizenship in order to flee to the U.S. And in order to do that, she needed to reach the Lithuanian consulate in Vienna. So Rose and the children traveled to Vienna and stayed with one of Rose's former teachers at the Conservatory of Music. Each day, the children stayed in that teacher's home by themselves, hiding out of sight, while Rose worked to gather the necessary papers. Once everything was in order, the family traveled to Kaunas, Lithuania, where Rose's parents lived, and from there, it was a waiting game. Which would arrive first, the Nazis or the visa permitting them to travel to the U.S.? The visa eventually arrived. Rose was lucky. She was able to come to the U.S. as part of the quota then in place for Lithuanian immigrants. In November of that year, she said goodbye to her parents. Rose and her children traveled from Lithuania to Sweden, where they boarded a ship to the United States. She would never see her parents again. After the Germans invaded Austria, an international refugee crisis developed. Jews were seeking refuge anywhere they could outside of Nazi control. 4 months later, in July of 1938, the U.S. hosted 32 nations in Evian, France, for an international conference to discuss how to deal with this ever-growing crisis. While all of the world leaders expressed their sympathy, few offered to allow more refugees to enter their borders. Those expressions of sympathy were cold comfort for the Jews of Europe seeking to escape. And their haste was only heightened after the events of November the 9th, 1938, now known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. On November the 9th, Nazi officials organized and instigated attacks on Jews across German-occupied lands, which now included Austria. Jewish-owned homes and businesses were ransacked and vandalized. Synagogues were destroyed, their religious objects and texts desecrated and burned. The local police witnessed it all, but did nothing to stop the violence. As the synagogues became engulfed in flames, the firefighters were called, but not to save the synagogues, only to ensure that the fires did not spread to the surrounding buildings. Local officials, the police, the firefighters, even neighbors, they were all committing violence or watching violence being committed, and not against strangers, but rather against men, women, and children whom they knew, the same people who they saw at the market, that went to school with their children, with whom they had grown up. Now, if you will recall, Frida and Herman Berger were safely in Selma, but their parents and most of their siblings were experiencing the events unfolding in Germany. Herman's sister Herta was working as a clerk in a store the night of Kristallnacht. After the store was destroyed, she knew it was time to leave the country. A cousin living in England arranged for Herta to emigrate and work in London as a housekeeper. Herta had hoped to later immigrate to the U.S. to be with her brother and his wife in Selma, but she married an Englishman and remained in London the rest of her life. During the events of Kristallnacht, 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, where hundreds died of brutal mistreatment. One of Herman's brothers was arrested that night and sent to the concentration camp of Dachau. We believe he was released a few weeks later after pledging to leave Germany. He fled to Belgium with his other brother. But when the Nazis invaded Belgium 6 months later, they were arrested again and deported to detention camps in now occupied France. In 1942, both young men were deported one final time to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. Hannah Berger recently found letters from those Berger brothers that they wrote while they were incarcerated in France to her parents in Selma. These letters express the continuing hope that arrangements could be made to free them from their incarceration and provide for their immigration to America. A plea, if you will. Herman and Frida Berger were a young couple, establishing their new lives in America. One can only imagine the heavy burden of guilt that they must have felt at this time and for years to come. Frida's brother, Sally, was taken to the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen after Kristallnacht. By early 1939, when he was released, the number of countries willing to open their doors to Europe's Jews had dwindled even further. One destination not requiring a visa was Shanghai, which ultimately admitted 17,000 Jews. Among them, 3 of Frida's siblings, Sally, his brother Julius, and his sister Dora with her husband. They would remain in the Hongqiu ghetto in Shanghai for 8 years before Herman and Frida were able to bring them to Selma in 1947. On the eve of World War II, the Nazis' territorial gains with their additional Jewish populations were now surpassing the Nazis' ability to rid themselves of Jews. And now the regime was poised to invade Poland, the home of 3.3 million additional Jews. Confronting that basic tension between their territorial and ideological ambitions, Nazi officials began to give voice to the previously unthinkable. World War II's outbreak is typically dated to the Nazi invasion of Poland on September the 1st, 1939. Within months, Jews in Poland were mandated to wear white armbands with the blue Star of David. This labeling, if you will, served to stigmatize, humiliate, and segregate Jewish families. With little or no choice or no notice, the Nazis began to move entire Jewish communities into what would become over 1,000 ghettos throughout Europe. Again, the Nazis' aim was to isolate and to segregate, to use physical removal as a step towards what they considered an almost spiritual cleansing of their hoped-for Aryan society. It's impossible to imagine the duress of those who at a moment's notice had to decide what to take when they were not even certain about where they were going or what would await them when they got there. Some of these ghettos were only in place for a short time, serving as a gathering place for deportees. Others lasted for months or even years. With large numbers of people confined to an insufficient amount of space, the inhabitants suffered severe overcrowding, starvation, and disease. Rose Bernstein Pollock and her children were now safely in Selma. They were reunited with her brother Reuben and her uncle Harry Mehring Sr. As for the family she left behind, Rose's younger brother Leo would later recall that when the Germans invaded Lithuania in June of 1940, quote, "It was open season on the Jews." The Nazis soon established a ghetto in Kaunas, the city in the central of Lithuania where Rose's family lived. Leo described the family loading up an old wagon with their things, and he and his father pushing the wagon down familiar streets until they reached the area surrounded by barbed wire where the ghetto had been established. Rose's family would later be deported to another ghetto before ultimately being sent to various camps in Germany. Leo was the lone survivor. Frieda Berger's mother and father had remained in Niedersachsen, Germany, for the first few years of the war. But then in 1942, they were deported to the ghetto of Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. Frieda's father died within 6 months. Her mother languished there for almost 2 more years before she was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau and murdered. But let's broaden our lens, and let's examine this from the perspective of those community members not of the Jewish faith. The ghettos were located in their cities. They saw them constructed. They witnessed the Jews moving in. Then they most likely witnessed the deportations to the concentration camps. They must have wondered, where did all these people go? And what happened to the personal belongings that were left behind? After Jewish residents were forced out of their homes, local Nazi officials would usually seal off their homes and take inventory. The dresses, suits, hats, shoes, pianos, paintings, family heirlooms. All were now forfeited to the state. A few months later, an ad would appear in the local newspaper announcing an auction, and officials would sell these items at a discounted price. And so we must ask, how many of those attending those auctions in Niedersachsen, Germany, or Kaunas, Lithuania, recognized the goods that were up for sale? And after the auction, Nazi officials would sell or rent the Jews' former homes. And so again, we must ask, how many of those that moved into these new dwellings understood or even asked what had become of its former residents? We know that not everyone supported the Nazis' actions. We know that some resisted, covertly and in some instances overtly. There are documented instances of former neighbors or friends slipping into the homes of deported Jewish families to stash family heirlooms for safekeeping in the hopes that the item's owners would someday return. We know that a range of responses to the Nazis' attempt to annihilate the Jews of Europe was possible. And so we must ask what we cannot answer. Why did so many people choose to participate? What distinguishes those that colluded with the Nazis from those that just kept their heads down, from those that resisted? The third and final phase that Professor Hayes describes lasted only 5 months, from the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 until the fall of the same year. Over this 5-month period, Nazi leadership came to appreciate that murdering the 11 million Jews of Europe was not just desirable, but now it was feasible. Motive had met means. Mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen followed the German soldiers into the Soviet Union and conducted mass killings of entire Jewish communities with the help of local police units and civilian collaborators. All of the town's Jews, men, women, children, and the elderly, would be rounded up in a central location and then transported to a killing site outside of town where mass graves had been dug. The victims were stripped of their clothing and valuables, then shot into pits. The process of mass murder is now known as the Holocaust by bullets. Almost 1/3 of the 6 million victims of the Holocaust were murdered in this brutal manner. But the process was resource-intensive and inefficient. The bullets the Nazis spent murdering Jews could not be used on the front lines. In September of 1941, the Nazis decreed that all Jews in the Reich, 6 years of age and older, were required to wear a badge which consisted of a yellow star. A month later, immigration from the Reich was forbidden. These steps ensured that all Jews were now easily identifiable and unable to escape. It was, in a sense, the construction of a ghetto comprising all of the Nazi-occupied territories. Only one step remained: transporting the Jews to their death. The final solution to the Jewish question, as referred to by the Nazis, had begun. In the fall of 1941, the Nazis introduced mobile gas vans in the East, describing them as more efficient and a more humane method of murder than the mass shootings. Paneled trucks were reconfigured to pump poisonous carbon monoxide gas into the sealed cargo areas as the trucks traveled with its victims locked inside. Death was cheaper and cleaner, but for the victims, death was painfully slow. Impressed with the method's early results, this technology soon became the basis for fixed killing centers, which perfected the process of mechanized killing. To truly understand the efficiency of it all, visualize this. Of the 6 million victims of the Holocaust, only 20 to 25% had perished by mid-March of 1942. That meant 75 to 80% remained. But a mere 11 months later, by mid-February 1943, those percentages were exactly reversed. 75 to 80% of the 6 million victims of the Holocaust were already dead. Mechanized, indeed. The Nazis would ultimately establish more than 44,000 sites of incarceration known collectively as concentration camps. Auschwitz, which opened in 1940, was the largest and longest operating camp. It was at Auschwitz where the first tests of Zyklon B, a mass murder agent used in lieu of carbon monoxide, were conducted. It was at the Auschwitz camp known as Birkenau that 4 industrial-sized gas chambers were built that could murder up to 6,000 Jews each day. Now, I know most of you have probably watched the History Channel at some point or another, or read books that tell of the inhumanity that took place at Auschwitz. But what you may not know, and what is one of the most chilling aspects of the Holocaust, is that the entire process in the camps was self-financing. That is, between plundering the Jewish possessions and leasing their labor, Auschwitz alone made 100% profit between 1941 and 1945. So that carnage could take place without seriously impeding the German war effort. In the meantime, the Allied armies landed in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. By that time, as we saw, more than 5 million Jews had already been murdered. We know that the Allies' primary objective was to win the war as soon as possible. It was not to liberate the camps and put an end to the slaughter. But as Allied troops made their way across Europe, they encountered the concentration camps and other sites of Nazi crimes. The concentration camp of Ohrdruf in Germany was the first to be liberated by U.S. forces on April 4, 1945. The horrors reported by the soldiers led Generals Eisenhower and Patton to visit the camp. On April 15th, Eisenhower wrote the following to General George C. Marshall in Washington, D.C. The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where they were piled up 20 or 30 men killed by starvation, General Patton would not even enter. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things. If ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. If you could see your way clear to do it, I think you should make a visit here at the earliest possible moment. Why did General Eisenhower visit Ohrdruf? Why did he implore General Marshall to do the same? Why, as we might now describe it, did he feel compelled to bear witness? Historian Ian Kershaw has written that the road to Auschwitz was built by hate, but paved with indifference. Built by hate. Yes, there was hate. Anti-Semitism had been present in Europe for centuries. It remains a blight to this day. Still in Germany, still in Europe, still in the US. Historians have established a clear correlation between the levels of anti-Semitism within a given community and the rate of murder of the Jews from that community. Romania and Ukraine, for example, had virulent and long-standing anti-Semitic cultures. The Jewish populations in both states were utterly decimated. On the other hand, in Bulgaria and Italy, where the culture was not as anti-Semitic, cooperation with the Nazis was less prevalent. The survival rate of Bulgarian and Italian Jews was markedly better than elsewhere in Europe. But hate alone did not cause the Holocaust. As a matter of simple arithmetic, it just couldn't. The task the Nazis set for themselves, this final solution, was simply too large for the virulently anti-Semitic to accomplish it on their own. They needed collaborators. They needed individuals, organizations, even governments to assist or at least not impede their efforts. And they found them. But the road to Auschwitz was also paved with indifference. It was paved by individuals that didn't speak up or ask questions when Jews were first barred from participating in civic life. Because there are worse things than not being allowed to attend a movie or shop in a certain shop, right? They didn't speak up or ask questions when the Jews were barred from certain professions, or when they were ordered to wear armbands, or corralled into city blocks, separated from their former neighbors by barbed wire. There were worse things. And again, they didn't speak up. And when word of the mass murder began to trickle out from the camps, when there was, in fact, nothing worse that could be imagined, it was too late. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a Polish-American rabbi and Holocaust survivor, has written that, quote, "In a free society, only some may be guilty, but all are responsible." All are responsible, meaning me and you. Me, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and you, the sons and daughters of those who welcomed the Bergers and the Pollocks to Selma. So today, on this day of remembrance, remember the suffering that was and the efforts that were made to put an end to it. Remember those who perished under the Nazi tyranny. Remember those who survived and enriched our communities. But also recognize that remembrance is not merely backward-looking. It is to speak of it. It is to be shaped by it. It is bearing witness. On this day of remembrance, we look backward so that we may move forward. We recall the humanity that is in all of us, that was here in Selma so many years ago, so that we may bring it to bear in the here and the now.
continue to bear witness. That is the charge to all of us here today. I'd like to invite you following this across the close to the lower hall where we have a reception and a beautiful exhibit, so I hope you will come join us there. And I'm a little overwhelmed. Thank you. I'm going to close with a Franciscan benediction that is one of my favorites. May God bless us with his comfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in this world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done.